This is Policy Voices by Friends of Europe. I'm Catarina Vila Nova. In the past 5 weeks, we covered a lot of ground on AI and democracy, from the impact on elections to rules and regulations, ethics, and media literacy. Today, we want to look ahead and understand what an ideal world looks like, where AI is working for the benefit of stronger democracies and economies. But who's best placed to take the lead on this mission?
I think the OECD is best placed because the OECD is the group of countries that share two things: a belief in a market economy and a belief in democracy. And these are exactly the two things that are under threat by AI, in particular generative AI. And these are also the countries that have mechanisms to create new infrastructure, or at least to create the recommendations for new infrastructure and pull together the technical and the policy side.
Welcome to the sixth and final episode of the special series on AI and democracy brought to you by Debating Europe. Today, what does an ideal AI future look like? I'm joined by Sebastian Hallensleben, the head of Digitalisation and AI at VDE, the Association for Electrical, Electronic and Information Technologies. I asked him what his call to action would be if we want to live in a safer world dominated by AI.
I would call for a shift in mindset. That doesn't sound very action-oriented, but I'll explain. We've got into the habit of trying to solve every problem and every risk posed by AI through AI governance. And I think that is only half the equation, because even if we put the best governance in place, we still don't reach bad actors, and we also only partially reach the open source communities.
Later in the show, we are going to play for you a snippet from the Friends of Europe's AI and Society Forum. You will hear from Lindsay Gorman, the Managing Director and Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States Technology Program. But now, here's my conversation with Sebastian Hallensleben. Sebastian, it's a pleasure to have you to wrap up our 6-part series on AI and democracy. How are you doing this afternoon?
I'm very well. Glad to be here on the podcast, and thanks for having me.
Throughout this series, which we conclude today, a common narrative has been that the European Union has becoming a standard bearer throughout its work in legislating and regulating artificial intelligence, with, the poster child being the AI Act. And the US, however, is leading on the tech race. There's no question about it. In an ideal world where artificial intelligence is working to create both stronger democracies, but also economies on both sides of the Atlantic, what aspects of each would you combine from the US and the EU?
It's a very good question. And I'm wondering if the framing might be a little bit too constraining. You're essentially asking, well, should we give free rein to technology, or should we put priority on regulation, with the US doing one and Europe doing the other? I think that from a European perspective, the question might be more, what is Europe good at? And how does Europe want to position itself in a global economy and in a global regulatory environment as well? There's quite often that talk about a third way, AI being used by the US, where profit is the biggest objective, AI being used in China, where maybe being able to steer and to some extent control things might be the top objective. And then Europe, where AI is being seen as something that needs to be regulated, where risks need to be mitigated, where fundamental rights are the top priority. If we question that narrative a little bit, I would like to broaden the role or the focus that Europe can have. The US is very, very good at running AI when there is plentiful data available, and the same goes for China. So both China and the US are not so good when it comes to using AI when there is little data available. For example, when we're talking about safety critical applications, where you can't let a chemical plant explode 1,000 times to collect training data, and then you can use that to train an AI to prevent the 1,001st accident. You have to find other ways of feeding your AI. And so any application where data is sparse, where data is not plentiful, is something that plays into the hands of Europe, because Europe is used to having scarce data due to GDPR, due to other regulations that pertain to data. I'd much rather see the position of Europe in those terms, in those framings. But I don't want to evade your question completely, work around your question completely. When you talk about best of both worlds in terms of Europe versus the US, I think what Europe has understood is that any kind of regulation is not so meaningful if it cannot be enforced. And any kind of enforcement is hard to do if you cannot measure things. So Europe has been quite good in trying to come up with metrics, with things that you can quantify to some extent. And that's not only in the AI Act, it's also in related initiatives. If we look at the US, it puts a lot of emphasis on the good intentions and the responsibility of corporations. And I would say that that's a relatively optimistic view to take. It may work. In some cases, may not work. If you want to rely on it, you have to think much more deeply about how you resolve that conflict in objectives between maximizing profit and still handling AI in a responsible way. They don't automatically collide. There might be coincidental alignment with both, but if they do collide, and sometimes they do collide, you need to understand what are the mechanisms to address that conflict of objectives, and how do you make sure that it's not always the economic maximization that wins the day.
Mm-hmm. So we talked about Europe's approach, we talk about American approach, and we talk about the Chinese approach. How does this all pan out globally? So what impact do all these different approaches have on, because we're talking about, now that you brought China into the conversation, we're talking about the three largest global powers. So what consequences does this have on pretty much any other geography that is not Europe, the United States, and China?
I would add one relatively small country to the mix there. If we look at the, if you like, the first league of thinking about AI governance, and that's Singapore. Singapore has started very, very early to consider, well, what constitutes good AI governance, and how can we measure it? How can we put it into practice? And this has culminated in the AI Verify framework and the AI Verify Foundation that is backed quite strongly in terms of resources by the Singaporean government, by IMDA, and I would include them in a kind of a view of the global landscape on who are the thought leaders, if you like. If we look at that top group, I believe that there is more scope for cooperation and for coordination than we might imagine. And this goes back to a very interesting experience I had in 2019, 2020, when I was chairing a IEC group, global standardization group on AI ethics. This was the very first group at the international level in IEC. And it was a dual convenership. The other convener was from China. And people said, well, that's not going anywhere. You're starting to discuss AI ethics with the Chinese, and they've clearly got completely different views on what to do and what not to do. But it actually turned out that we found common ground surprisingly quickly by understanding what is actually the scope of things that can be agreed globally and what is the scope of things that are simply determined by jurisdiction. When we talk about the characteristics of an AI system, when we say, well, how do we want to measure the transparency of an AI system? How do we want to measure privacy? How do we want to measure fairness and so on? It's relatively easy to get consensus, even globally, on metrics. How do you measure those things? However, if we then go to, well, is that good enough for a certain application? Is a certain level of fairness good enough for human resources for selecting candidates? Is a certain level of privacy good enough for a certain AI application in healthcare? Those are assessments that really depend on the jurisdiction and where different countries or different economic blocs and political blocs come to different conclusions. And by teasing apart the issue like that, which kind of seems obvious now, but it wasn't obvious at the time, to say, yep, let's come up with ways to describe the system as opposed to ways to decide, is this good enough or not in a given application and jurisdiction? That really helped us to bring that global picture together.
You know, throughout this series, we focused a lot on trying to explain and understand and discuss the current state of play, be it on regulations, on ethics, etc. But I want to look a bit more into the future and ask you, we talk a lot about the ideal worlds today in this conversation, but again, in an ideal world where AI is working to the benefit of democracy, what does this future can look like? And do you already see examples of success? You just mentioned before Singapore as a global leader. Would you bring it up again here?
I would actually put it in slightly more abstract terms and also bring the OECD into the picture there as well. If I try to imagine a world where AI is helpful for democracy, not just not harmful, but where AI is actually helpful for democracy, what we really suffer from is an overload of conversations we're having, an overload of information that we're having. And AI, as it has emerged over the past few years, is actually capable of consolidation. So it's capable, for example, of seeing 20, 30, 50, 100, 1,000, 10,000 comments and distill groups of opinions. Maybe it's a discussion about how to address climate change. And AI could look over 10,000 comments and say, yeah, within those comments, there are these 5 broadly similar solutions. And we can consolidate them, we can cluster them, and we can maybe ask the few hundred or few thousand people who were putting forward that rough direction, whether they would be prepared to put their weight behind that particular clustered, aggregated solution, so that you don't have 10,000 voices, a cacophony of 10,000 voices having an argument, but all of a sudden you have maybe 5 concepts, 5 approaches for solutions that you can then have a discussion about. So this would really help us to make use of the vibrancy, of the activity, of the need for people to talk, to voice their opinion, and at the same time take us to a point where, yeah, we can't implement 1,000 solutions at the same time. We also can't implement 5 solutions at the same time, but at least we can have a political debate in parliaments. We can look for majorities to pick 1 of 5 solutions. And so I think that aggregation of the debate, that could be one of the positive use cases where AI really supports democracy.
You mentioned already your work with the OECD, but you already worked with national governments, with the European Commission, with Council of Europe, even with UNESCO. Who do you think should take the lead?
I think the OECD is best placed because the OECD is the group of countries that share 2 things: a belief in a market economy and a belief in democracy. And these are exactly the 2 things that are under threat by AI, in particular generative AI. And these are also the countries that have mechanisms to create new infrastructure, or at least to create the recommendations for new infrastructure and pull together the technical and the policy side. And moreover, the OECD has an excellent AI secretariat. It has also an excellent team dealing with disinformation. And so all the relevant building blocks are there. And we're actually already starting to pull them together. So last year, we launched a call for partners for a global challenge on building trust in the digital space in the era of generative AI. And the special thing there is that it calls for solutions that are not mere technology solutions, or that are not mere policy solutions, but rather solutions that combine policy and technology. And this is something that I can't really think of any other organizations that would be able to launch such a call. And also this November, we're going to have the first Digital Trust Convention, again, under the roof of the OECD and with a number of other organizations co-hosting, the Atlantic Council, Bertelsmann Stiftung, Mila, and a number of others. And again, goal of this effort is to bring together all the communities that are necessary to address this crisis of trust in the digital space. We need cybersecurity people. We need internet infrastructure people to consider, well, that upgrade of the digital space, how is it going to work and what could it look like in practice? We need people who are knowledgeable about disinformation, people who are knowledgeable about user acceptance, about connection to policy development and so on. So all this fits very, very well under the OECD's roof. And because of the relatively close alignment of the 38 member countries plus a number of accession countries, it's possible to come up with something relatively substantial relatively quickly. It's obviously nicer to have it worldwide at the UN level, but it's much, much harder to take steps there with sufficient speed.
We want to end this series with a call to action on how to navigate and how to make the AI era safer for everyone. What would your call to action be?
I would call for a shift in mindset. That doesn't sound very action-oriented, but I'll explain. We've got into the habit of trying to solve every problem and every risk posed by AI through AI governance, be it regulation, standardization, voluntary commitments, whatever. So we try to solve AI problems with solutions around AI. And I think that is only half the equation, because even if we put the best governance in place, we still don't reach bad actors. And we also only partially reach the open source communities. Both are there to stay. For the bad actors, unfortunately. For open source, I think it's broadly a good thing that this community and this approach exists. But we have to assume that those are there. And therefore, when we talk about solving AI problems or mitigating AI risks, we have to promote solutions that have got nothing to do with AI governance. Things like pseudonymous identities, things like trust protocols. They are not AI solutions. They are solutions to make the digital space more resilient so that the digital space survives the existence of AI in the hands of bad actors, and that the digital space survives the existence of open source AI, regardless of what technological progress will bring in the coming years. If we look at two tracks, yes, we do need to think about AI governance and to improve it and to optimize it. But at the same time, and just as importantly, we need to think about resilience of the digital space. And I would maybe conclude with a relatively broad call of actions. The digital space is what we make out of it. We have got the power to shape the digital space. It's not like the weather, but things happen and all we can do is kind of put up an umbrella. But in the case of the digital space, we can shape it. We can talk about what should it be like? What do we want it to be? What is our vision? And then work together to implement it.
Sebastian, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was Sebastian Hallensleben, the head of Digitalisation and AI at VDE, the Association for Electrical, Electronic and Information Technologies. I'll leave you now with Armando Kanani, Friends of Europe's chief spokesperson, speaking with Lindsay Gorman, the managing director and senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States Technology Program.
Welcome to this conversation, which is about the economic fabric of our societies. We now move to the social fabric of our societies. It's to do with democracy. We want to talk about the implications of AI for democracy, its health, stealth, and its goodness. Whether AI will be, as we said in the earlier segment, that AI can be a force for good, but it can also be a force for bad. So on that, it gives me great pleasure. Lindsay, you're here. It's great. I'm glad you're able to join us online. You've had an illustrious career both in the US government, and now you are the executive director, forgive me if I get it wrong, of the German Marshall Fund. So you've got a kind of really interesting background in both being in the heart of the Biden administration, but now in this iconic thing called the Marshall Fund, which was created at a time to a certain political context. And so it's really good to have you with us, because one of the things about this session is that AI sees no borders. There are no borders to it in terms of our ability to regulate it, command some attention of it, requires international governance and international collaboration on a level that we have not probably witnessed before. So I'm going to ask you a really simple question. What's the biggest threat that AI poses for our democracies from your experience so far?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question, and it's really a pleasure to be here in this Friends of Europe forum. I think we share so many commonalities with the German Marshall Fund, which, as you mentioned, was set up as part of a gift from the German government in the spirit of the Marshall Plan as a thank you. And I think this sort of the transatlantic relationship and cohesion and building cohesion on these issues of our time, especially about how we're going to govern and derive value from new technologies like artificial intelligence without compromising or sacrificing our democratic values, and in fact advancing them, is probably one of the most important questions we could be tackling. And building that cohesion is very central to our mission as a think tank and the program I lead, which is the technology program. I think there's definitely there are definitely some of the positive use cases of AI, and happy to talk about them in a minute. But to your question on the threats, there are, of course, a spectrum of them. I think we tend to divide them into kind of the long-term, potentially these existential threats, and then more of the here and now. So the long-term, the AI-enabled bioweapons, the Terminator scenarios of AI taking over the world and forcing us all into slavery. Some of the more, I think, concrete here and now are around re-entrenching bias in AI systems, making decisions about government functions and financial decisions about how AI is going to impact work. I think we're all already seeing AI being used in the workplace in positive and negative ways. But the issue that we are mostly focused on in terms of the threat space when it comes to democracy is really how AI is influencing our information environment. And so this year, with 2024 being this historic election year, we've taken a focus to look at how AI is playing out across global elections. Now in the United States, with it kicking up, but we've been studying this question for the last year, starting with Slovakia's election in the fall of 2023, where there was the first really highly publicized deepfake audio case of the sort of not pro-Russian candidate was fakely recorded as wanting to raise the price of beer. Obviously, a very unpopular position should it have been true, and potentially colluding with journalists to kind of rig the vote in some way and try to overcount votes. This is a theme we see in the United States when it comes to election denial. And so what we're really focused on when it comes to AI is deepfakes, audio deepfakes, visual deepfakes, images, and videos, and just the democratization of the ability to create realistic fake content. So now we're actually releasing this tracker, a map of AI in global elections next week, where we've already tracked 133 instances of deepfakes over the last year around the world related to elections that got major media coverage. And why I think this is such a threat, and it's hotly debated. There are many folks out there who would say that, well, it's not really having an impact. A lot of these things aren't that believable. And I think that there's some truth to that. It's very hard to quantify the impact of these things, but AI is entering into an already very precarious information environment. It's already so exceedingly difficult to keep track, to keep the story straight and figure out what's true and what's not. And AI is adding the visual dimension to this information environment as well. And I think that's where the existential threat to democracies particularly could be. If we can't trust our own eyes and what we see, if we get to that point where we have the same amount of doubt with what we currently have when we read with visual information, that has implications for evidentiary processes in courts of law, where showing security camera footage and how we perceive our political leaders and engage in political life. And lastly, I would just say that this is an area, we think a lot about the competition between autocracies and democracies, and this is an area where we have a true asymmetry as democracies, because we actually need quality information to engage in political discourse, to select our political leaders. Autocrats, they have an advantage if in a confused information environment where no one can tell what's fact, what's fiction. They thrive on the ability to kind of poison the information well. So I think that when it comes to AI specifically, that's, I think, the biggest threat is to our information environment.
This is very helpful and also deeply scary. In terms of what's happening right now, in that you've been obviously watching the US elections, one of the most significant in terms of shaping future world politics and relationships, if we can put it that way, depending on who gets in. What are the instances you're seeing right now in terms of this? Because I can imagine it'll intensify. You can imagine as we get to November. What are the kind of examples you're seeing of the malign influence and use of AI?
Yeah, I think it's really to confuse the information space. So now I think we've got 36 instances so far, just in the few months in the lead up to this election. Some of the more outlandish and ones that folks might have heard about. Recently there was a sort of a whole maybe contretemps about maybe between Trump and Taylor Swift about who she was going to endorse. But actually, before she made her endorsement of Harris, Trump released videos and photos, or he shared photos in which there were a couple of authentic photos of people wearing T-shirts at a rally, a political rally, that said "Swifties for Trump." The Swifties, who support Trump. And then he created, someone created, he shared an AI generated image of Taylor Swift with the Uncle Sam hat and pointing and saying, "I support Trump," as if she were endorsing Trump. And then in addition, there were also AI generated images that were less clear of more crowds of Swifties for Trump. I don't know that anyone necessarily believed that this was a true endorsement. And I think there's a case to be made for that as one of the reasons, at least Taylor Swift says, that she actually ended up coming out and endorsing Harris. So it almost kind of backfired on Trump. But some of these images were, hard to discern, especially when they were paired with the real images from the rally, what was true and what was not. I would say that was a case where it probably backfired. We've seen less high profile instances of AI generated media in the electoral context. There is one instance, there was a deep fake created of the governor of Utah purporting to admit to ballot fraud and getting fake signatures for his candidacy on the ballot. And he just says this right into the camera. Again, I don't think we're at the point where people are not seeing these as deep fakes and necessarily believing them as real. But this is the thing with disinformation. It puts even a cheap fake, a not AI-enabled manipulation, can kind of put a doubt in your mind, put an idea in your head, and it's very difficult to understand and quantify what effect those have. The last example I would raise goes back to this concept of the liar's dividend, that when we can't trust what's fake, we also can't trust what's real. So Trump pointed to crowd sizes a couple of weeks ago at a Harris rally when she was stepping off the plane and said, well, that's an AI generated image. That's not real. So the ability, I think, actually to cast doubt on what's real might be perhaps more potent than some of these AI generated images and video that experts can clearly discern at this point are fake.
And that's it for today. Policy Voices will be back next week, so be sure to subscribe to Friends of Europe's podcast wherever you're listening to this now to be notified right away when the next episode drops in your feed. I'm Catarina Vila Nova, and I'll be with you again next Friday. Goodbye.